Okay, hello and welcome everyone to our virtual roundtable on Admin 101. The most thrilling, I'm sure, title that we could give this, but I know I always get lots of questions related to kind of business operations for local societies, and I thought this would be a great chance to ask and hopefully answer as many questions or sort of figure out what people are dealing with and need help with further. Just a quick sort of note that I do want to give for this program in particular, because we are going to be talking about things that may have to do with business and or legal operations. I will say I am not a lawyer. I am not your lawyer. Some of you may be lawyers, but chances are good you're not anybody else's lawyer on here. So this may be things that we are talking about today that we should not take as specific legal advice, but more for informational purposes only. But hopefully we'll all do our best to try to give the best information that we can. So with that, I want to just open it up generally to start to see if anybody has any super pressing administrative topics that they wanted to talk about today. Nothing. Oh, Sandy, go for it.
Is there an actual checklist available of those things you need to do every year?
Okay, great question. And a couple of things, sort of, Sandy, for sort of that question of what do you need to do each year? And this relates, I'm assuming, to sort of thinking about yourselves as a nonprofit organization, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and I'm probably going to call on my colleague Rachel Ona quite a bit if possible as we go today. So I don't know if there's a specific document that I've seen that lays it all out, but can certainly talk about websites and places where you can find that sort of information. One is Common Good Vermont, and I'll put that link in there, but they have a whole website, and I feel like they might have something like that, but I don't 100% know for sure. And the Vermont Secretary of State's website is also a great resource for the specifics related to Vermont. But there's a couple of things. So every year, if you are a registered IRS nonprofit 501c3 organization, which I think most folks are, you do have to do a 990. The type of 990 that you have to do depends on a variety of things, but most often your budget. And for smaller organizations, that's what's called the online postcard. So it's pretty much literally just going online and checking a couple boxes saying you're doing the stuff you're doing for not a whole lot of money. So that is something that you have to think about every year. The deadline for that is based on your fiscal year. So it's due X number of months after the end of your fiscal year. So if your fiscal year ends on the calendar year, if it ends in July, there'll be different deadlines for that each year. Every other year, you need to do a biennial report with the Secretary of State's office. And that's one that usually they will send it to you or a reminder to you to fill out. And it's basically wants to make sure you're still there and you're still doing what you said you were going to do, and then who's involved in the organization. So your officers and that sort of thing. So that's every other year. And you can check the status of your organization on the Secretary of State's business directory to see if you are in fact up to date with your biennial report and when it is due next. I'm going to see if I can pop open that link.
I can grab that one, Eileen.
Awesome. Thank you. So those are the couple of very specific things you need to do annually. And then other things will really depend on your bylaws. So a lot of times your bylaws will say that you will have an annual meeting. So once a year, you need to have an annual meeting. And again, that's all dependent on what your bylaws say as to the when and the how and where. But those are pretty much the things you have to do to keep yourself in good standing with both the state and the IRS in general.
Can you hear my phone ringing?
No, I can't. I don't know now I do.
How do I stop that?
There we go. Now you got it. Okay. Rachel, anything else I missed specifically you think of?
I think it's really great to start with the legal requirements and to remind us all about, and I'm curious if for a show of hands for those who are on camera, are you a 501c3? Is your organization? Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Great.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the requirement from the Secretary of State's office, which, you know, it's also, there's a fee involved with that as well.
Yep.
But the report is not, don't let that word scare you. You basically have to put in names and addresses and check a couple boxes. It's not asking for substantive information about what you've been up to. So yeah, I think what is required federally at the state level, and then remember what your bylaws say. And Eileen and I are both involved with an organization, and we occasionally forget that, oh yeah, go back to the bylaws. It actually shows you when you're supposed to do certain things and keep the kind of the official directors and officers appropriately elected and moving forward.
Yep.
But I'm curious, Sandy, if part of what you're asking also has to do, because it's getting to be that time again of year where folks who have historic houses or historical societies in historic structures are maybe thinking about opening up again. And if part of your question about the calendar had to do also with kind of the flow of seasonal work around having a building that you are caring for.
It didn't, but that's a great idea. Yeah, we haven't really gotten that far yet, but we should be thinking of April and opening in May.
Mm-hmm.
But mostly I was just curious if there was a checklist, and I think you've answered my question, because yes, I would forget about the bylaws. And we actually just decided to change our bylaws to fit our current organization because of the size.
Yep. Yeah, and you know, I will say that I've got many thoughts on bylaws, which I'm happy to talk as little or as much about as possible. But those really, the bylaws are the sort of way you do your work. And I always hope to sort of get folks to understand that they need to be as simple and as detailed as actually will make it possible for the organization to do the work it needs to do. So I think a lot of us get stuck with bylaws that we want to do too much, or we have bylaws that are outdated that don't fit what we as an organization can do or want to do in the way we govern. A lot of groups had to deal with this with COVID and the pandemic, because a lot of them would say, you have to, you know, like, we have to have our annual meeting in the third month in this place, and you couldn't, literally. So that was brought about a lot of those changes. Yeah, Sandy.
On my thing. And regarding the bylaws, now that we have changed our bylaws, do they have to be filed with the state, or anybody?
This is where I forget, Rachel. Do they officially? I don't think the bylaws do. I think only if you change your articles of incorporation. Is that right?
I think that's right, but I'll spelunk around the Secretary of
Okay.
State's site and get some instruction.
Yep.
It's a great question. We should know that.
I know. I should remember, because again, those are two separate documents. Your articles of incorporation should have been the original document when you incorporated, that talks very distinctly about things like mission and who you are and where you are. And those generally don't get changed very often at all. Whereas your bylaws, they shouldn't be changed a lot, but can be changed more often.
Eileen, how often would you recommend that organizations review their bylaws? Is there
Ooh,
kind of a rule of thumb for that?
yeah, I don't know if there's a specific rule. I certainly think, maybe this is part of a yearly checklist, is just looking at them and saying, yes, we are doing what it says we're supposed to be doing in the way we're supposed to be doing it. I don't think that that's a bad idea to make sure that you've done that. And that can also go along, obviously, with when you elect new board members, and they should have copies of the bylaws. It's a great chance for both them to look at it and for any of the existing folks to look at them and say, yep, this is what we're doing and why, and go from there. Barbara, did you have a comment or question?
Yeah, I was going to say that at the genealogy library, which is part of Vermont French Canadian Genealogical Society, we took 2 years during COVID and rewrote all our bylaws utilizing the state laws, utilizing best practices from other nonprofit organizations. And I think in our policies and procedures, we put that we would do a serious review every 5 years.
Great,
And that came from recommendation from somewhere.
great. Yeah, I think that, maybe something like reviewing, what you call like that serious review of bylaws is also a great thing that can happen maybe in tandem if you're doing strategic planning. That might be a great time to also look to say, oh, are we still doing this based on what our plans are?
It's also a good time to see if your policies and procedures correspond.
Yep. Yeah. Sometimes I find that we start doing things and they might not be done in a bad way, but they might not be done in the way that we said we were going to. And so which do you want to change? And a lot of times it might be changing the bylaws, because if you're doing it the way you're doing it and it works and it's all good, then keep doing it that way. And make your bylaws sort of match the ways in which your organization can actually function. Mark.
So is there a good place to look for best practices for writing bylaws? Where did you look, Barbara?
I'm not, well, we had on our board a fellow who works with NEHDS and has for many, many years, lives in Vermont, came on our board, and he looked at him and he said, this just doesn't meet today's practices. And that's how we got started. And it was because he is involved at the higher level at American Ancestors. And with that, that's when we went and looked at nonprofit legislation at the state. We also, not there, but the last time we did our bylaws, we looked at Litchfield, Connecticut. Just because. We just picked some place that was well established, that had multiple aspects to their existence. And then I took a couple of webinars, but that was in 2015, and that's outdated.
Yes, I did put another couple links in the chat. One was for Common Good Vermont, which is the nonprofit sector. And then I put the link to the actual state statutes for nonprofit corporations, because that's always your baseline. And it does actually tell you a few things about things like what do your bylaws require and such, or what could they be if you don't have different ones. So I think that's always a good one to go back to as well. I have a number of bylaws I've collected over the years from organizations, so I'm always happy to share those as I can for folks who are looking for. Again, Barbara, I think your point is great of like, we don't need to nobody needs to reinvent the wheel with these things. So if you find an organization that is working well and they think their bylaws are working well for them, like, copy what you can and just go from there.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Robin.
Hi, I looked at the website that Rachel, you put in the biz filings, and it doesn't go to a direct website. It goes to a number of websites. One of them goes to a state form that it looks like you have to fill out your, let me go to that. The Vermont, if you go to Vermont State Business Division. Oh no, that's not good. One of them goes directly. Oh, an entity search.
Mhm.
Anyway, the link that you gave takes you to a number of options, and I'm wondering which one you'd like to direct us to.
The biz filings one for Business Inquirer, that's a way to search for your organization or for any nonprofit for that matter to see
Oh,
what
okay.
your current status is. So
Okay.
that's good to go in to see, are we up to date with our reporting? When did we, it will have, who is it listing as our officers? You can see if things are up to date in there.
Okay, great. So it's the entity search. That's
Mhm.
great. Thanks.
Yep.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Other admin pieces people want to chat about today.
Yeah.
Barbara.
I have a question. And maybe this is a consensus item. We're looking at our mission statement
Mm,
and I'm supposed to bring back to the other two people on the committee how to integrate our digital collection, our digital connection with other organizations, etc. And I don't want it to be too broad. I'd like it to be pithy, but I think we have to have something in the mission statement about digital. Help.
great. Any thoughts on that? Or any ways in which people have been either updating their mission statements in that realm?
We did not. Oh, I'm sorry. I cut off Ellen. Ellen, you should go first. I can't find the hand, so I'm using this one.
That's all right. Right now I can still see everyone, so we're good.
Okay. Oh, we did not update our historical society mission statement, but we actually that was another organization. We're going to write a DEIA statement, and I'm just wondering if you have any examples of that. I could look around, but maybe you have a place to start. I've written one for another organization, another nonprofit that I'm in, but I'd be interested to know what other people are doing about DEIA statements or DEI, one or the other. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so and I think Sandy sort of what's a DEAI statement? Is that the question? Okay. So and again, this gets sort of said in different ways. So DEAI is one way, IDEA is another different way. So DEAI stands for diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. So I'll share our page where we talk about some things just to give you an idea on what they are for those of you who don't know it. But has anybody else sort of tackled that already? Either for their local society or for somewhere else.
Well, I can share that the one that I wrote for the other organization, again, a nonprofit, I took just the Vermont Council on the Arts has a statement,
Mhm.
and they have the list of those that will be included. And it's a very good comprehensive list. And so to be cautious and inclusive as possible, I just took their list. Anyway, it's then again, that's the Vermont Council on the Arts.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, so I shared our links for us, and what we've done at VHS is we've done a couple slightly different things. We've done what we call institutional values, which are kind of broader statements about ourselves as an organization, and then a diversity and inclusion statement. So you can kind of see what we're thinking of, and some of this comes generally. Thanks, Rachel, for Arts Council, and they call it an idea. It's interesting that slightly different groups call it the acronym slightly different. So the arts are on IDEA, museums are on DEAI, and so it's always interesting to see that. But some of this is about especially in cultural heritage, the ways in which we have not been open institutions, and sort of how we think about being open and welcoming in a lot of different ways. So yeah, and this again comes back to the different materials that we can have as an organization. And Barbara, sort of the point of what is a mission statement and what does it do for you? What's a vision statement and what does that do for you? What are things like a DEAI policy or statement? What do those do for you? And what do all these different pieces do to sort of help you create a well-functioning organization? What its financial policies do for you, or procedures do for you, and how that works. Sandy. Oh, you're still muted. There you go.
Yeah. So if you have nothing written, isn't it automatically assumed that everyone is included? I'm not sure that I understand why we have to point fingers and say, you're included, you're included. If you start doing that, you're bound to leave somebody out. So if you say nothing at all, I don't know. We're not saying anything at all at this point, but that doesn't mean we need to rewrite, it's just a observation.
Yeah, and I think again,
I can jump in and say, I was just going to look at the Arts Council statement, and it's less about, because I was curious, do they really list different communities? Because I had the same concern, Sandy, that once you start listing who's included, it's really hard not to leave somebody out and cause bad feeling. So but I think it's less about listing who's welcome or who's included. What they're trying to do, and a lot of organizations I think are trying to do, is actually to get beyond a statement of we are in favor of and support DEAI initiatives, and to actually demonstrate what they are doing in that realm. How are you as an organization making sure you are as welcoming and as inclusive as possible? How are you trying to expand the audiences that are aware of you and are interested in coming and engaging with you? So they talk about what they've done and what they're currently working on, because this work is thought to, it's a process, and it's something that we are all we're all called to engage in all aspects of work and life now. So it's like, how can you be thoughtful about this and sensitive and aware? And everyone's welcome, Sandy, but how do you make sure everyone out there knows that? So I think that's maybe that's a pathway into that way of thinking about audience and your place within your world.
Ellen, you had your hand up before. I don't know if you have a comment, another question.
I had a question, but it's so naive that I'm kind of embarrassed to bring it up. But anyway,
No.
we're talking about working on our bylaws and the place of the endowment within the bylaws and how that should work. And Rika is on this too, considering this with me. She may be able to add more information than I can, but I'm just wondering how other organizations determine what the endowment can be used for. When can you enter it and use it? What can you use it for? It seems to me it should be extremely broad, because you never know when, you know, you're going to need a lot of money quickly. Something terrible happens to the building. And I that's all. I really, we're starting from zero, so I really don't even know what I'm asking, but thank you.
Great. Barbara. Oh, still muted.
The first thing you need to do is look at how you accumulated that money. If it was given as a designated gift, then that carries with it in all your financial processes. If it's just because you think you have a large amount of money and you have earmarked it, then that should be an independent statement that you can attach to your bylaws, but I would not put them in the bylaws.
So what do you mean by attach it but not put it in?
Well, if you pass whatever meeting it is that you're going to change your bylaws, rewrite them totally if you want, and then you have whomever is authorized to sign it. That's a document. The other is a financial document, and you keep them together wherever you keep your hard copies. Same way with your digital copies, because you may be getting designated gifts, as we have 4 designated gifts. They're not large, but we have to keep track of them. I mean, it's not just our policy, it goes along with some of the IRS stuff that I can't remember. And so we know that in that big pot of money, if we want to repair this particular wooden box, there is money there to do it. We know that somebody gave us $10,000, of which we use a percentage each year for education. The $10,000 corpus is dedicated. Now, we lump that into our endowment pot, but it's not truly an endowment. And that's why I asked how you were using the term.
For the money in our endowment is not designated.
Then why
Oops.
is it an endowment?
I am such the wrong person to be bringing this up, but I'm new, and at any rate, I'll deal with it. I think the endowment.
Find out from your organization why they're calling it an endowment. If it's a reserve fund.
That's what I think it is.
If it's a reserve fund, then you can just have either at your annual meeting, have your entire membership vote that the reserve fund can be used for XYZ, or have your board do it. Because as an endowment, it really is encumbered. I mean, if it's truly an endowment. If it's a reserve fund, that's a different thing.
Super, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
It's Alice Cadano.
Yeah.
Westminster is in the process of establishing an endowment, quote unquote, fund. I questioned whether it needed a definition as to how it should be used. And I was told, no, it did not need a definition. However, from what I'm hearing from Barbara, it would not be an endowment, it would be a reserve fund. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. And I've talked to a number of high-powered accountants.
So if we call it an endowment, it needs to have a definition on how it is spent and how it is collected. What kind of monies go into it? Is that correct?
I would not say a total yes. Usually an endowment is based on a restricted gift or a restricted fund that has been established by the organization. But if you want it unrestricted, you really shouldn't call it an endowment. You can name a reserve fund and put any boundaries of utilization on it that you want.
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest, from my understanding, the biggest thing about the essentially what an endowment is meant to be is that the principal is not spent, that you are only spending interest. So that's the big limitation on what you think of an endowment. And then there's, as Barbara's talking about, there's lots of variations as it regards to reserve funds or designated funds and quote unquote, what they can be spent on. So an endowment could be potentially spent on anything, but you're only supposed to be spending the interest.
All right.
Depending on
That's
your
good.
policies. You can limit what an endowment can pay for in your own policies, but that's more, it's limiting interest spending versus reserve funds, which may be either donor designated or board designated, and those might only be able to be spent on specific things.
Well, thank you. That's
Yeah.
very.
Yeah, and I think that the aspect of endowments that is really attractive for organizations is this idea of wanting to build up funds so that you are not having to fundraise a certain amount every year and have that quote unquote in the endowment. But right, there's different ways of thinking about what do you want kind of this money for, what do you want to do for, and then figure out how. I would say for my thing for financials, if you can keep it as open as you possibly can, that will help you in the long run. So if you don't have to designate something for a specific thing, don't do it. If you get a donor that wants to specify, that's fine. But if you don't have to as a board, be very specific about what you can spend money on, keep it as open as possible.
All right. What our initial problem was our lifetime membership dues. They do nothing. They are not as valuable, unfortunately, as the annual membership. And we wanted to make sure that they were going to earn their keep. And so we talked about taking our lifetime memberships and establishing an endowment, quote unquote, fund. That's where I had the question. So, and I also wondered about being so specific about what kind of money goes into that fund.
Yeah, and I think this is great. This is another great policy or procedures to have is sort of fiscal or financial policies or procedures that can help you to determine. And those are the kinds of things, again, that you can change as you need to, but they aren't, strictly in your bylaws. And again, also the difference between how you literally keep track of your financials in something like an accounting software versus where they quote unquote physically exist in like a bank or an account, and that there's different ways of managing those in different manners, depending on what you need the money for or what you're able to do with the money or not. So, endowments again tend to be put towards longer term investments, whereas reserve funds are probably in sort of shorter term investment accounts, because they are less restricted. just sort of looking at Rika's comments before from the DEI discussion. Again, that they are aware of that most of the items come from old white families in town with little or no representation of historical BIPOC families or individuals, which naturally tends to limit our audience. And so again, I think this comes back to the point, Sandy, of the why of aren't we all welcoming? That goes back to thinking of, as we're history people, what was the past? And in the past, that wasn't the case. And so I think being open and proactive about that is why we feel the need to do that now, is because we weren't in the past. And so how do we work towards being that way and making sure everybody knows that we want to be that way?
I think that's why the statement is important, is to, this is part of the acknowledgement, you know, there's 3 different parts. It's the acknowledgement. It's, as Rachel said earlier, it's what are you going to do about it, or what's going to be your policy, and then, you know, what you believe. So it's those 3 parts: the acknowledgement, what you believe, and what are you going to do about it.
Mhm.
So thanks, Rita.
What else?
Are there other categories, Eileen, that you put within admin of historical societies and other nonprofits? You know, we've got kind of the governance bucket, we've got the financial management bucket. Are there other components that we should be thinking about when we think about administration and board responsibilities?
Oh, that's a good question. And I think the couple things, I guess, that I would ask the folks here is, do people know what their responsibilities are as a nonprofit board member as it relates to Vermont law in a lot of ways? When you signed up, did they tell you? Besides bylaws. Yeah, I'm gonna link to another document. It was done a number of years ago by the Attorney General's office, but I think it's still pretty good. It's last updated in 2018, so there might be some slight post-COVID changes that I don't know about. But that talks through what your responsibilities are as a nonprofit board member. So I think it's always a great check-in for people. And I think one of the things that I think is important about this right now, and what I'm hearing, and I'd love to hear from you all, is a lot of places, and this is not just local societies, it's volunteer organizations across the board, are struggling to find board members. And so kind of in understanding what these responsibilities are, or what you're hearing from folks, you know, what are some of the reasons behind it, and has anybody had any success in addressing that in their organizations or their communities?
Westminster has found that we need to ask. We need to invite instead of waiting for the person to volunteer. And we've been very successful lately. And my other question in this is, how does everyone feel about the number of board members? Is it better to have a larger board or a smaller board? Meaning, perhaps 11 as opposed to 16 or 17. Guess that's a good one, huh?
Right? That's
Alice, those both sound really big to me, but I'm curious how many board members there are for the organizations represented on this Zoom.
Well, presently we have 10, with the president non-voting. Well, I
Oh.
accepted it. Yeah. So it would mean a 5-4 vote. And the president would not vote. And that bothers me. Simply because there's no chance of a tie where the president would have the option of voting. And I personally would like to see an odd number of board members rather than an even. And then we get into the discussion, well, how many more? Or how many less?
I'm going to launch a poll. I don't know if all of you can see this, but this is what you can do in Zoom. 3 to 5, 6 to 9, or 10 plus board members. I will say again, the minimum number of board members you have to have under Vermont law is 3. So
Mhm.
that's why that's the lowest right now. All right, so yeah, we're kind of sitting in the mid-range here on 6 to 9 seems to be the most popular. Awesome.
Sandy's hand is up.
Okay, Sandy.
Okay, that's one of the things we just rewrote because I think it was 8 and there's very little interest. And we're lucky if we can have 4 officers. So we have, I think, specified that there would be at least 1, but no more than 4 additional. So I guess we would go from a minimum of 3 up to possibly 8. But right now we're operating at 5. So
Okay.
Thank you.
we started with 9.
Big help.
Yeah, and I think this is another place where I encourage folks to think about keeping the bylaws as broad as possible to help out with these times when you either don't have enough people or want to have, for some reason, if you get more people that want to be actively involved. That's a great spot to do that. So besides sort of number of board members on your bylaws, what are the sort of most common things that folks are sort of changing their bylaws or thinking about we need to change in their bylaws that we either have talked about or haven't talked about?
Well, Westminster right now is concerned about our collection policy, which of course involves the bylaws and the corporation papers and mission and all of that information.
Yeah.
And I will say the rewriting of the collection policy bumped off of the deaccessioning and making tiers of your collection.
Mhm.
So it's like a vicious circle. And every time you pick up one job, it adds 2 more to it.
Yeah, right. That sort of never ending circle of of updating and looking at the different pieces of what we have to do and how that sometimes can feel quite overwhelming and overcomplicated, right? So, back to Sandy's original question of like, what do we have to do each year? It's like, well, you only have to do this one thing literally each year to be a nonprofit organization, besides doing what else it says you need to do with your bylaws. But then, policies and procedures come into play, and are ways in which, again, that, we need to function as organizations, and how that continues to overcomplicate sometimes the work that we do, or that it's hard to understand all of those pieces as smaller organizations. Yeah. Anything else? I think, Rachel, your question about sort of what else is under admin, you mentioned briefly facilities or historic houses. We haven't talked about facilities at all, which is kind of an admin bucket I would consider. But anything else kind of administrative, organizational that we have or haven't talked about?
I suppose if there's a paid staff person, I'm not sure if that's the case for many of you, but that the kind of the supervision and oversight and evaluation and compensation of that employee or those employees would be part of it.
Yep.
What if it's a contract person and not an employee?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I think both employees and contractors add another layer, because there are very specific rules as it relates to contractors versus employees.
Mhm.
And the interpretation thereof. I don't know, all y'all I served for a number of years as one of my town auditors for our town, and was considered an employee under IRS definition. And so had to get my, W-2 for my $75 a year. So, it's can be tough to navigate some of those pieces. Anybody have any sort of questions, thoughts on some of the human resource side of things? Sandy, it's okay.
I feel like I'm raising my hand a lot, but my thoughts, just because we're recently getting into this, is so we're going to be hiring someone to paint our building. That person will be an independent contractor, and I guess I want to make sure that he carries his own insurance. And if he doesn't carry his own insurance, will it go under our insurance? I don't know.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, if I pay him over $600, am I going to have to send a 1099 at the end of the year? I didn't buy into that job. No. But I mean, that's the things that I worry about.
Yep.
And you're saying that, yes, I do have to worry about them. Is that right?
You might have to. I mean, again, this comes back to, how you both classify the work that he did and the licenses that they have and all that kind of jazz. But, certainly a possibility and something you'd want to make sure you look into to know that you're doing things properly, based on what you have for structures. But yeah, insurance, we didn't talk about insurance either, which is a whole other thing to be thinking about. Barbara.
I put it in the chat because I didn't want to talk anymore, but how are you various organizations dealing with the land acknowledgement issue? Do you put that? I'm not sure I want to put that in my bylaws. Because I think that's a potential changing target. But it needs to be said.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you. Not putting, again, it's not an actual piece of how your organization can do business that needs to go in bylaws, but has anybody sort of either done an acknowledgement statement or use one when they do programming, or have people that want to use one when they do programming? No.
I'm getting pushback from my board.
In what way, Barbara? Of wanting to do
They,
it?
they
or-
see it, they see it as unnecessary. It's not totally negative. It's like, why bother?
Hmm.
And, I really have to say, because it's my gut. So I just didn't know about other organizations. I do belong to some organizations that start meetings with acknowledging where they are.
Barbara, I got pushed back. This other, a nonprofit that I'm involved with, that I wrote the DEI statement. I put a land acknowledgement statement in, and that got, they didn't want it in there.
Yeah.
And one of the problems was, we didn't know, because, you know, we were saying that it was, acknowledging it as Abenaki, land, that there's this conflict going on within the Abenaki
Yeah,
with the
I know about it.
Canadian. So, you know, we didn't even know what to say, but that's not the reason it got canceled. But I got pushback as well. But I think it's got to be in there someplace, even if it's a little more generic. You know, we don't use the word Abenaki, or just,
Indigenous.
yeah, exactly. Yep. But I'm going to bring it up again because I think it needs to be there.
I will too then.
And I wonder if you had programming and a presenter, as Eileen was suggesting, said, yeah, I'm happy to do a program for you guys in Stowe or you in Moncton, but this is, you know, I have a you know, I have a statement I use prior to any of my speaking engagements. Do you have one, or should I use mine? And if it's something that they hear from someone you've brought in initially, it might help normalize it for folks who maybe don't see the point, as you're saying, Barb. I do wonder, Eileen, if there are resources out there that make a compelling case from the Indigenous perspective of why this is important, and why it's not simply white people giving lip service to this idea that, yeah, there were people here before us.
Yep. Yeah, and
The
I think,
Minnesota Arts Council has a very good website
okay.
that will direct you to some Indigenous Arts Council to help write statements, understand statements. There's videos and everything else like that. I don't know anything around here.
Yeah, I will say, you know, in general, a couple of the points of, you know, the question of whether to do it or not, that this is a very complex topic, and that is, you know, one of those things that's difficult for us, especially with non-Indigenous organizations, to navigate, but also that, going back to Sandy and sort of the point of the DEAI statement, of statements that are kind of just done to check something off the list, are not sort of really helpful in that sense. So if you're thinking about this or trying to work on these kinds of things in your organization, think about both the intent, and then, you know, as we're talking about the different levels of what it means to both say it and then how to live it, or to integrate it into what you're doing and what that means. And so thinking about the ways in which you work towards that, or think about it openly and talk about it openly, and make, you know, sort of have those check-in points to make sure that you are doing things in the way that works with the values that you have as an organization, or what you want to accomplish in your mission as an organization. Rachel has to pop off. We have about 4 minutes left. I'm going to call this last call for anything we haven't talked about, or anything we have been talking about that we want to give a last bit of info for. Okay. Doing pretty good. All right. Thank you. Thank you all for joining. And we have a couple plugs before we go. Just the next up, so this is our last virtual roundtable of 2024. So next up will be our League of Local Historical Societies and Museums annual conference, which is May 10th in White River Junction. It's our 70th annual. So that's kind of a fun number for us. So we hope you'll join us. Details on that are going to be coming out soon, hopefully. And then a couple other things, Rachel had to leave, but coming up just in a couple days on Thursday, the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance is doing a webinar on collections care MacGyver style. So that's a great one. They did part of that session at one of our league conferences a couple years ago and was quite popular. So if anybody's interested, that's another great webinar coming up. And as always, our website is vermonthistory.org. Follow us also on all the social medias. And we'll look forward. Again, if you have any questions after this or things you want to talk about more or more links, when I share the recording, I'll also share the links in this one as well, because we put a lot of stuff in there to go, but hopefully you'll be getting the recording and to share, feel free to share that with others as we go along. Great. Anything else for the day? Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.